So the first thing that we have to deal with is, what is Paul doing there as he talks about what it means to follow Jesus? And we remember that Paul is writing to citizens of the Roman Empire. And with that understanding, the way that he talks about this cross or crucifixion is, to be perfectly honest, and to use a technical historical term, it's incredibly stupid because the Romans did not view the cross as anything that could disarm anybody who is in power. The cross was a symbol of Roman domination. It was a tool of propaganda. They would take the worst of the worst, beat them, strip them completely naked, nail them to these big cross beams, and they would do it in a public place so that everybody nearby would know that you are being executed as an enemy of the state. The enemy, or the state, views you as worthless, and now to demonstrate it, you are going to agonizingly suffocate over the next 8 to 12 hours. The Roman orator Cicero would write that a Roman citizen in polite company will never talk about crucifixion. It is taboo. It is too brutal, too horrifying, too shameful and humiliating to talk about. And the ancient Greco-Roman world did not value humility at all. It was not considered a virtue. If you've got it, flaunt it, as they would say. I mean, they didn't actually say that, but, you know, the idea, whatever, I thought that's funny. And so Paul is writing this kind of bizarre, mysterious, contradictory thing that through this humiliating, horrifying propaganda tool of the empire, God disarmed the empire. God disarmed not just the empire, though, also these spiritual forces that tear us as human beings apart. That from here on out, the things that we would do, the spiritual things where we're abstaining from eating certain things and we gain knowledge of certain spiritual things, like none of that matters anymore. So what is Paul doing? Well, he is demonstrating something called the theology of the cross. And we're going to return to that in a little bit. But there's a problem, because when we talk about the theology of the cross, it sounds really boring. I mean, like, the theology of the cross. And we might think of, like some stodgy academic Theologia Crucis, which was laid out by Martin Luther in the Heidelberg Disputation of 1518 between the Dominicans and the Augustinians, and oh my gosh. And you might be thinking at this point, like, Eric, we get it. You went to graduate school so you could learn all of this obscure things. And that's the danger, actually, that you can have in terms of talking about the theology of the cross, because in actuality, this is something that's very personal, and it's extraordinarily powerful in terms of what it means to follow Jesus. And as it turns out, it's also incredibly personal to me. And so rather than, laying out the theology of the cross, I want to actually share a little bit of my story. Because the theology of the cross was taught to me at a time when I needed it the most. So I don't remember if we planned it like this or not. But it's particularly meaningful that I get to talk about this today, really this weekend, because yesterday, October 14th, marks 12 years since I was diagnosed with leukemia. I was escorted out of my first class at seminary of that day by the campus nurse and walked down the street to the local emergency room because the nurse had called the doctor who had ordered these blood tests and said, and I would learn that he had said this exactly, you need to find that man and take him to the ER yesterday. I have a chronic form of leukemia. It's slow growing. I still technically have it. But at the point when they found me, it was rapidly accelerating. And without treatment, they suspect I would not have made it 6 months. And when we asked the doctor, what's going to happen, what are my chances, he just said, I have no idea. The average age of the person with this kind of leukemia is 65, and I was 22. I was just too far out of the standard picture. So needless to say, my world fell apart 12 years ago. It was horrifying. And to make things even worse, we had just moved to St. Louis. I had just started seminary about 5 weeks before that. To make things even worse, I called to tell my wife that I was being escorted to the ER, and they're not telling me why. I have no idea what's really going on. And when I did that, I was interrupting the beginnings of her office birthday celebration for her. I've ruined every birthday ever since. Sorry. So everything falls apart. Being told that, we don't know what's going to happen is horrible. And then 2 weeks later, I get a call from my brother. He was calling to let me know something happened with my mentor. He was my pastor for a while when I was at school as an undergraduate at Baylor University in Waco, Texas. And his name is Kyle Lake. And he and I for at least a semester, I interned kind of under him. He mentored me. He taught me so much about the church and life and culture and how that all kind of comes together. So as it turns out, and this happened 2 weeks after I was diagnosed, he was a Baptist pastor and at a University Baptist church. And it's a long story, but because he was a Baptist, when they do baptisms, they have a baptismal font that you are immersed in. And I actually really like that practice because we say that in baptism you are buried with Jesus. Like you are baptized into his death and you are raised in his resurrection into new life. So that act of being submerged underwater and then pulled out is incredibly meaningful. And I think part of the reason why we don't do that is we baptize infants, and that's not safe. But, but unfortunately, as my brother then explained, Kyle stepped into that baptismal font in front of his congregation, and his wireless mic stopped working. He went to adjust a microphone, and there was a wiring problem, and he was electrocuted in front of his congregation and died. I had talked to him 2 days before that. Not to make it all about me, but, this is my story. That wasn't supposed to be funny. That's fine. It's when I'm trying to be funny, it doesn't work, but yeah. When I talked to him 2 days before he died, he said, Eric, I want you to know that if you call, I will pick up. I don't care if I'm in a meeting. I don't care what's going on. I want to walk with you through this. I want to support you. And I left that conversation feeling incredibly encouraged, even though life was falling apart as I knew it. And then he was gone. That was 2 weeks. Within the next 3 months, there was a suicide in my family. My 2-year-old cat died. Again, not funny. Yeah, everyone's nervously laughing. My mom had melanoma. Thankfully, they caught it in time. And my grandmother had a stroke. That one actually was a little funny. She was fine. And she insisted that she just needed a new cream for her face because it was drooping. And, and being the stubborn Irish woman and so on that she was, she was a wonderful lady, but now I'm fine. She drove herself to the ER while having a stroke and parked in the emergency room parking lot. And what we later found out is when she went to park, she parked like perpendicular across parking spots because the woman was having a stroke. But she ended up being fine. But within that first year of seminary, my grandfather, her husband, died unexpectedly, and then I was in a car wreck, a nasty one, and I still actually deal with some of those injuries. Everything fell apart, it was one of the worst periods of time in my life, and I've had some big ones. And it came at an interesting time in seminary, because when you go to seminary, you are studying to be a pastor, a servant of the church, and a servant of God. And we would never admit it, but when you enter into the seminary, you have a pretty big ego. You wouldn't admit it, but you're pretty sure that you might actually be God's gift to the ministry. You would never admit it because the professors would bring the pain down. And there were definitely times when sitting amongst your classmates, you just scratch your head and go, "You are an insufferable twit. What is going on?" But if you're being honest, you'd see it in yourself too. You might actually be the next Billy Graham or the Lutheran Billy Graham or something like that. And one of the things that, I don't know if they do it now, but the professors would do is they introduced us to something called the Theology of the Cross. And they used it, or they did that with a book called On Being a Theologian of the Cross by Gerhard Forde, F-O-R-D-E. I can't recommend that book enough. It will wreck you in the best way. But this theology is meant to put you in your place before God. And it came to me at the worst time in my life when everything else was falling apart. And it goes like this. It's hard to summarize, but it goes like this. If you want to know what God is like, and we call that like revelation, like God revealing himself, you look to Jesus. Jesus is if you want to know what God is like, you look at Jesus. Not the Bible, though the Bible shows you Jesus, but there's a difference there, a distinction. And if you want to know what Jesus is like, and you look through his life, it's not his miracles, it's not his acts of compassion or anything like that, or his teachings, though those are wonderful. But the moment when Jesus really reveals who he is when he goes to his death. He has this prophetic awareness that he is dying in the place of his people, which ends up being all of humanity. And if you ever read the stories of Jesus' crucifixion, you'll notice that the writers are very careful to point out that it is Jesus who chooses this. He could have gotten out of it at any point. In other words, all of life, which is what it means to have the revelation of God, that is the point of life. All of life comes down to this moment of crucifixion, of immense suffering and death, when all of the imperial and spiritual powers came crashing down on this one innocent man who chose this. So then, what would it mean to be a theologian of the cross? Well, all of life is viewed through the lens of suffering. And that sounds really dark. When I realized that there was the kindergarten class singing and there were going to be all these parents, it's like, oh man, you picked a doozy of a week to come. We're going to talk about suffering and death. But it's not as dark as it sounds. One of the main tenets or observations, I mean, this is all just pulled straight from the Bible, is this: the best that you have to offer to God is likely to be your most mortal sin. The most offensive thing you can offer to God is what you consider to be your best. Now again, that doesn't sound like good news. But when I was in my darkest, that was good news. There were days when I could not attend class because my bones hurt too much and I didn't have the strength to dress myself. And I would lay on the ground in one of our rooms with a heating pad, just going from place to place, waiting for the hot water heater to fill back up so I could take a bath. I couldn't get relief. I was too sick to do so many things. I would go to the doctor to get a treatment to help with the side effects of the treatment. And if you've dealt with cancer, you know what that's like. I had nothing to offer anybody, much less God. I couldn't do much for my wife, if anything, but complain and throw up. I wasn't a great friend because I wasn't extremely engaged, though I did have one particular friend named Carl who really reached out and walked with me. Among others. I had nothing to give. And when you have nothing to give, you realize the profound truth of this statement. Because if the best that I have to give to God is actually disgusting, then you wonder, why does he love you in the first place? Because the love of God has nothing to do with what you can offer him. We as human beings love to be able to justify our existence, whether it's in relationships or at work or before God. That if you're feeling particularly defensive and your spouse or a longtime friend or a family member says, and you take it personally, well, you're not doing that, or you've made that huge mistake, and again, you're kind of at your most neurotic, which is to say you're at your most human, what are you going to do? You're going to go, yeah, but I do these things. Do not tell my wife I mentioned that. Because I'm pretty bad about this. I've been at St. Paul's for a year now, and I still, in my most neurotic, I'll be thinking about, all right, in the last 3 weeks, I did this, and this went well, I did this, and that was okay, I did this, in case Pastor Scott, it gets really mad at me, and then I think I have to justify my existence here at St. Paul's. Now, he has at no point said that I need to justify my existence at St. Paul's. This is purely in my own head, or to say my own heart. Humans need to be able to justify themselves. We need to be able to say, look at these things I bring to the table. These are the things I'm good at. This is what is valuable. This is why my existence is justified. And in the theology of the cross, all of that is dismissed as putrid because God loves us for his own sake. We have nothing to offer God that he lacks. And so he simply chooses us. That when we ask ourselves, well, does God see anything in me that he loves? The answer is yes. It is that which he creates in your heart. That in our baptism, which is a way that God chooses us, we die with Jesus. Again, that lens of suffering and death. We die in Jesus. We are raised in new life because the death of Jesus doesn't end that story. The death of Jesus is how he disarmed the powers, because 3 days later he walked out of his tomb and defeated even death itself. So when we die in Jesus, God begins raising the dead within us. And a theologian of the cross understands that when God looks at us and sees something that he loves, it's because he created it. He put it there. There's another book called The Hammer of God by Bo Geertz. It's another one of those books that our professors made us read because they were trying to break us down. And I found myself going, I'm already broken down. Come on. But there's a great scene in it, and I'll paraphrase it a bit, where this guy sits down with his pastor and says, I want you to know, Pastor, that I've done it. And pastor goes, done what? He goes, I've given Jesus my heart. And the pastor says, why would you give him that? Because the heart is where all of the corruption lies. The heart is the thing that's saying, look at me, I can justify my existence. God, I am valuable before you. And then the pastor says to this guy, no, the point isn't that we have something to offer God. The point is that God is walking along this road and sees a pile of trash, and he notices in that pile of trash there's this rusted out old can that has no value. And he takes his cane, sticks it out and grabs that can, and he loves it. The can itself is worthless until he gives it worth. And he delights in it and walks on his way. The theology of the cross is how God truly saves us, period. When we have nothing to offer, and that time will come. Whether now or later, whether you've experienced it or not, it will come when you realize that the things that you hold up and say, see, God, I'm valuable. God, I do these things. God, I work with these people. I have these gifts, which God gave you in the first place. And I do these things for the church, or I do these things for the people I love. Honey, aren't I valuable? See, Mom, I've got something that I can give you that's worth it. And you realize that God says, it doesn't change anything, because God has already chosen you. The other aspect of the theology of the cross, and I'll close here, is that you do not assume that you can discern or divine the mind and heart of God. Now, there's always going to be a place for that prophetic voice in church life and culture. But when you start assigning meaning to the activities and actions of God, then you're not doing the theology of the cross, because the theology of the cross is humility. It is recognizing that when God acts alone, that it is God's desires that God will pursue. That when something tragic happens, man pulls a trigger in Las Vegas, Hurricane Maria wipes out an island, Hurricane Harvey floods Houston, an earthquake hits Mexico City, a mutation in your bone marrow, my bone marrow, that nearly kills me, an electrocution of a celebrated pastor and friend, death of your loved ones, loss of jobs, loss of meaning, that the question of why did this happen can't be answered. We would love for it to be, but to say why is to pretend to know the inner workings of God's heart and mind. But a theologian of the cross understands that we can't do that, but we view all of life through the lens of the crucifixion of Jesus. What happened at the crucifixion? It was Good Friday when he died, a miserable, humiliating, lonely, naked death that opened the way for the most redemptive act in human history. That when Jesus walked out of that tomb, we realized that that story didn't end. When I got escorted to the emergency room actively dying, that story didn't end. In a weird way, when Kyle died, that story didn't end, at least for the rest of us. That the story doesn't end with a Vegas shooting. The story doesn't end with Hurricanes Maria or Harvey or an earthquake or anything else. Because a theologian of the cross realizes that we view suffering through the lens of the cross, which is to say that we wait for its redemption because the redemption of suffering is guaranteed. Guaranteed. We don't know how. We may never see it. But my experience has been, you get glimpses. The question is not, why did this happen? But rather, it is, how is God going to redeem this suffering? Because the theologian of the cross knows that Sunday is always coming, even in the midst of Good Friday. May we be theologians of the cross, unafraid of suffering and struggle, because that is how God reveals his redemption. That when we stand before God, we have nothing to offer him, and yet he gives us everything. We do not earn it. We do not enrich it. We do not grow it, because it is he who creates within our hearts that which is lovable and that which is pure and good. Because when we die with Jesus, we are raised with him. And may we view the suffering of this world, and there's been a lot of it this year, not through the lens of divining and discerning the motives of God, but rather knowing that God always redeems, because we view life through the lens of a crucifixion on a Good Friday that always leads to Sunday morning. That when we find ourselves in a moment of death, know that resurrection is coming. God redeems all suffering. Let's pray.